Was Vladimir Putin's Achilles heel, because I knew, like, I mean, we're in day 3 of the all-out invasion, that their body count was going to be enormous. And I believed that as that news seeped out into the Russian public space, when those people understood how many of their husbands, sons, fathers, brothers have been killed, that was going to be the tipping point that brings people onto the streets and eventually brings Putin down. As we come towards 90 days of war, that figure is going to top 30,000. 30,000 Russian sons dead on Ukrainian soil. They never should have came here. They never should have came here. The liberation of Ukraine is going to lead to the downfall of Vladimir Putin, and those are both good things.
Paul, we are so happy to have you back with us. This is Paul Niland. He's the founder of Lifeline Ukraine. He has helped so many people in despair. He founded a suicide hotline based on the 2014 war veterans. And here we are 8 years later, and I'm sure you are incredibly busy. But what I first want to talk about is the clip that we just saw shows that you are, 7 months ago, believed that it was going to be Ukraine that actually puts an end to Vladimir Putin. 7 months on, Paul, how are you feeling? What do you believe?
I still believe exactly the same thing. In fact, my conviction of this is even stronger. And there are many reasons why I believe this, but Putin massively miscalculated. And there are various reasons why. There was a good piece in the New York Times a few days ago talking about the faulty information that he was being fed in his planning, and then the lack of planning, that sent a military unprepared into a country where, of course, they were going to meet resistance. But I mean, if you look, for example, a few months ago, he held this ceremony in the Kremlin, and he made this big grand declaration. These 4 provinces are now a part of Russia, and they're, Russia forever, and these people are Russian forever. And the reason why he did that, what the calculation is that Russia's nuclear doctrine says if there's a threat on Russia itself, then they can use nuclear weapons. So that's why he decided to say, well, that's now Russia, right? But the Ukrainians just ignored it, because it doesn't matter what he does. It doesn't matter what piece of paper he signs. It doesn't matter who he shakes hands with. And all of those men on stage, they all look very, very nervous. And Ukraine just carried on with the counteroffensive. And then 40 days later, Kherson was liberated. And,
amazing.
And when you look at Kherson today and what's been happening there over the last couple of weeks, specifically the last few days, in actual fact, Christmas Eve, there was a massive missile attack on Kherson, killing 16 people and injuring another 65, I think it was. But those 2 months before, 40 days before, were Russians, and Russians forever. Well, but the point is that Putin has no path to any kind of victory in Ukraine. It will be a humiliating defeat for him, and that is the end of him, whether it's at the hands of the oligarchs or the people, or there's talk of a power struggle with Prigozhin and Kadyrov, whatever. Putin is toast.
Well, so I want to quote you in Byline Times. It's very important that people know that you have risen to the occasion of becoming a reporter. You are based out of Kyiv, and last time we spoke with you, your city was a bit of a sanctuary city from this. It is no longer the case. We're going to talk about that. But there's a very important article that you just published, The Putin Regime, an Obituary. And there's so many brilliant parts of this. But when you wrote The Putin Regime is dead, it has been killed off because of the folly of the man that has sat at the top of the mafia pyramid for over 2 decades, Vladimir Putin himself. And you go on to delineate some really important points, but one of the things that I think is so incredibly important is when you wrote that same corruption that Putin and those around him have personally benefited from, where theft is at the core of everything they do, has gutted the fighting machine that they fooled the world and themselves into believing they possess. That is classic autocracy, where they're draining all the resources out, taking it all for themselves, and leaving really nothing of note to be able to fight with. What he has really is propaganda. And what you're basically saying is Ukraine and no one else is buying it, except, of course, the fifth column in America, which is perpetuating it. But can you just tell me, what drove you to write that? It's just so brilliant.
Well, thank you very much for the kind words. And I took my first steps into journalism actually back in 2014. I'd owned a publishing company prior to that, and so I'd been exposed to writers and editors and so on. But the very first piece that I had published somewhere was Putin had written, between the Crimea and Donbass phases of the war, Putin had written an open letter to the 28 heads of state or heads of government in the EU, as it was then before Brexit, which Putin helped as well. But I read this and I said, I'm just going to take this apart line by line. And an editor contacted me and he said, we would publish that. And so that was me like dipping my toe in. And it's been something, I'll tell you something, it's almost therapeutic for me, really, because, I have the opportunity to get published in respectable publications, not just Byline Times, but SEPA and the Atlantic Council and so on. And that means that I have an influence on events and can shape conversation, can provide facts and give people a better understanding of what's going on. But
absolutely,
that specific article, I actually wrote the headline for that. I was sitting in a restaurant and it just popped into my mind that what's needed is an obituary to write how that regime has come to an end. Yeah. And I wrote that about 2 months before I wrote the actual text. And often when you submit something, the headline will get changed by the editors, but in this case, they left it as is. But I listen to a lot of it necessarily, sadly. I listen to a lot of military experts and I've been hearing this about the hollowing out of the Russian military from within because, the generals automatically steal 50% of the fuel that gets delivered to them, right? And, they have these legions of phantom soldiers that exist on paper so that their salaries can be transmitted to someone, but they're actually not a soldier with a gun in their hands that you can send to war, right?
I love the fact that the Russian army literally took the plot of Nikolai Gogol's Dead Souls and turned it into a money-making scheme. Brilliant.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Wow.
We love that fact as well, because it is, that mismanagement, that gross greed that exists in the upper echelons of Russian society. That is, as I wrote, that's one of the things that has contributed greatly towards Ukraine's victory. But let me give you another example, right? I mean, we see all of these mobilized conscripts, 300,000 of them that have been, they had no desire to go to war. They've got no motivation to be fighting in this war other than the hatred of Ukrainians that is a result of the propaganda that exists in Russia. But, what are they complaining about? They're complaining about not having been trained properly, not having proper equipment, and, having been to the range once and being given a single magazine of bullets to fire. Because they've got no ammunition, all of these are contributing factors to Ukraine's victory and Russia's defeat.
Well, so many things that I want to talk to you about. But one of the most important things that the president of Ukraine said when he was here just before Christmas Eve, it was incredibly powerful speech, was that the only way the Russian people will be free of the Kremlin is to defeat the Kremlin in their mind. And for me, that was very important because there's not enough leaders in my mind acknowledging the information war, which Hi-Fi has taught me is just war. We don't even qualify it anymore. But you note, I thought that was a brilliant move by him. But you also note in this particular article that you believe that Putin is losing the information war, and that despite the tightly controlled airwaves in Russia, that they've lost the plot. And that's very encouraging to me. Why do you believe that? And give me some indications of it.
So there's a person who does an incredible amount of very difficult work. Julia Davis is her name. So she watches all of these Russian propaganda shows, and she'll put them out with commentary. She'll write articles about them, and you can see, for example, after the liberation of Kharkiv Oblast, which was, I mean, it was a rout. The Ukrainian military ran through there in the space of like 5 days or something like that. And what you saw on the propaganda shows that followed that was not only a pushback of why have we, ceded these territories, this was supposed to be ours, et cetera, but you saw a sort of a freedom as well, that people were actually speaking their minds and actually saying, so what are we doing this for, right? And I think that what happens is that when the Ukrainian military achieves some kind of great success, and there's other successes coming down the line, I can talk about which ones are coming next, but it takes them a while to craft a new central narrative that everyone has to stick to, right?
Bingo.
And so there's a couple of days where they really don't know what they're supposed to be saying until somebody says that we've regrouped, or we've straightened the defensive line, or whatever their latest excuse is. The goodwill gesture on Snake Island, or when they left the Kiev region, that was also a goodwill gesture as well. Like, they really don't know what to say until somebody directs them to do it.
Brilliant.
And what you just described is the exact same behavior as the legions of online trolls. You can tell when their messaging is aborted because everything goes silent for a few hours or a few days.
Sometimes 2 days. Yeah,
it's the same pattern, which is why I say information warfare is warfare.
Yeah, right. One thing I noticed is that people post clips of Donald Trump's propaganda on Twitter. I always watch it on mute. And for the first time, I noticed, I watch almost everything on mute. I read everything. I was a news producer for decades, and I have post-traumatic news syndrome. I can't be around televisions, cable news, none of it. I read everything, and that's the source. The source documents are everything. And yes, I'll watch video clips, but so mute is my get down. But for the first time, I noticed that Trump is a mirror image of the main Russian TV propagandist. And I put their images side by side, those strongman faces. Hi-Fi knows how to say his last name. I cannot.
Soloviev.
Okay, so you look at Trump and Soloviev side by side, and those are Putin's two top TV propagandists. It just occurred to me. It's like, it's so clear when you actually are watching the mannerisms, and it's interesting because both of them, Trump was at one point a Democrat. The main guy, say it again, his name always. He used to be a respectable journalist. Somewhere along the way, in Trump's case, it was, he was a made man somewhere, probably back in the 80s when he started moving money for the Russian mob, I'm sure. But it was interesting to me, and for me, being able to do this kind of work where I can write about the things that I see in the parallels, it is my hope that we keep showing what's really behind the curtain, which are these, small, horrible, weak men who've been trying to control the narrative. And in Putin's case, he was stealing from the very beginning. That is something I learned from Karen Darwisha. She showed what he was doing in St. Petersburg when there was supposed to be relief coming in for people who were starving, and millions of dollars that were supposed to go to food relief evaporated. And they went to Putin, and they went to Putin's, cronies. And first thing, among the first things he did when he came to power was kill a propaganda puppet that made fun of him. Obviously, pardon Boris Yeltsin, but make it impossible to criminally prosecute a sitting president because he'd been stealing from the very beginning. So when you see videos of Russian soldiers with no food, archaic weapon, absolutely dispirited, versus the incredible images you see of Ukrainian soldiers, it's just such an, the clarity between, heroism and just, the abuse of his own people. And of course, Ukrainian people could not be more stark.
So there's so much to answer in what you've just said, but exactly the point that you made was what I was waiting to say as well, which is that, they project this image, but actually behind the curtains, behind all of that bravado and big man and I'm strong and all the rest of it, they're actually weak and pathetic, particularly in the case of Trump. And
yes.
And you talk about Solovyev's conversion from having been a journalist and Trump, somehow somewhere along the way having become a made man. It's greed that's at the center of it, and then along with the greed is the power, and it's the power to abuse people and get away with it.
Yes.
And that abuse, I mean, you just talked as well about the vast difference in how equipped the Russians are and how the Ukrainians are. And you also talked about the deprivation of food imports when, well, I mean, Vladimir Putin was the intersection between the mafia and the authorities when he was in St. Petersburg, as the deputy mayor. But, it's that complete lack of empathy. It's they just don't care about other people. And it's this whole combination of problems. And just going back to what Hi-Fi was saying about the trolls, by the way, and how they are an integral part of war. The day that my Twitter life changed was not when I was blue ticked at the onset of this phase of the war since the 24th of February. The day my life changed was the 22nd of November of 2013. And the revolution, what was called Euromaidan, but became the Revolution of Dignity, it was one day old. And all of a sudden, like, my Twitter life had been follow a celebrity or two, a footballer or two. I mean, like normal kind of, interactions, just it's a fun platform, right?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, any of us who were in Kiev, any of us who were showing any support for what was a day old on Maidan, we were instantly hit by what we now know to be the St. Petersburg troll swarm, right?
Wow.
And it was literally, I mean, it was within a day, and it was relentless, and it was nonstop throughout the revolution. And then after the revolution,
oh my God,
Crimea came, Donbass started. We've been the subject of their distortions and propaganda and lies ever since. And I've fortunately got quite a thick skin towards that kind of nonsense now. But it was really shocking at first.
Wow. I want to point out that when I wrote a tweet, which as I look back sounded very distraught, it was kind of a eulogy for Twitter and knowing that, my time might not be long lived there because they were going after journalists. I do want to say that Paul reached out to make sure I was okay and that my mental health was okay. And that meant a lot to me because, quite frankly, my mental health has not been okay since 2016. I too have developed a thick skin, but this team, I first got attacked online and offline in 2018. I was already being, I was already dealing with a lot of ops that I later figured out were ops. But by 2018, when I worked on a campaign to take out Russia's favorite congressman from Congress, Dana Rohrabacher, I got in the crosshairs and I haven't been out of it since. And some days are harder than others. And our friend Jim, they have relentlessly gone after him because he exposed Mike Flynn as being a charlatan and exposed Mike Flynn as being a traitor and exposed him for, QAnon and all of his ties there. And so it's just been a nonstop paid operation against Jim, and being Jim's friends, we get a lot of the, attacks as well. So
I got one the other day. This is a good one. I stated that, while Elon Musk is pulling all this online hissy fit BS that he's doing on Twitter, what is the actual thing that's going on right now? And my guess would be data extraction. He's getting everyone's DMs. He's mapping everyone's networks. He's seeing who everyone's is friends with, what they support. Cambridge Analytica ran Ocean's profiles. I'm sure those are being built on all Twitter users if they haven't already been built. And one of the paid trolls actually took this and went to Twitter and called me stupid, racist, bigoted. They didn't use homophobic, but anyway, basically attacked me. And then 4 days later, Twitter records of 400 million users showed up that a hacker was selling on the dark web. So it's like, come on.
Talking about Elon Musk, which I wasn't particularly bothered initially about his takeover, other than the fact that he paid a comically ludicrously inflated price for it. I mean, no way is it worth $44 billion. But anyway, I was kind of thinking that, you know what, the platform, it will continue. It must continue. It's an important source of information. It's an important source of news. I manage who I follow there to ensure that I've got a news feed that I can manage and is of a good quality as well. But today, Dmitry Medvedev, the man who Putin allowed to replace him briefly as president because he's the only senior politician who's even shorter than Putin is, right?
Yes.
He put out this. He put out this absolutely ludicrous list of developments that he predicted we would see in 2023.
Yeah.
And one of the things, I mean, he talks about the breakup of the United States, certain states declaring independence, there being a civil war again, and Musk winning a presidential election, right? And because Musk has briefly had his ego stroked by Dmitry Medvedev, he replies to it and he says epic thread exclamation mark.
And he came back 5 hours later.
5 hours later, yeah. And so obviously a few people had said to him, do you realize that you've just condoned a man who is condoning genocide in Ukraine, or whatever they said to him, and he knew that he needed to make amends or something. But I mean, come on.
I will lead everybody to the piece that I wrote, Unmusked, for Byline Supplement, where Fiona Hill says that Musk is transmitting messages for Putin, where Michael McKay, incredibly Ukraine scholar, says that Musk is turning Twitter into VKontakte, a Russian propaganda outlet under the guise of a social media outlet. And I would posit that he's a chaos agent and it's very serious. And if you look at what it costs to build some war machinery versus what it costs to own the public square and then try to control and destroy communications, I think it's, then Hi-Fi is like my coach when it comes to, a lot of the framing for this war. And I think it's very serious, but I hope you're right. I hope that you're right. And that the power of Twitter and the direct communications that we've all been able to foster will somehow result in diminishing the billionaires and the propaganda versus, the inflation of it. So we shall see.
I
go ahead.
I think there are things that are outside of Musk's control because he cannot control his own thoughts and decisions sometimes, and I think it's the shareholders of Tesla who will finally say, what in the hell are you doing? I don't know. Tanking the stock prices over there. We'll see.
I don't know, because I believe it's all been one big Ponzi scheme, just like crypto and everything else. And in the 2014, the FBI warned that America was being infiltrated by Russia through the Russian investments in Silicon Valley in our halls of academia. And 10 years later, we are seeing it out loud, obviously and overtly. Hi-Fi, what's on your mind?
So I got a couple things on my mind. Everyone's like, how could Elon spend $44 billion on Twitter? And now he's just burning it. I would remind everyone that, the Department of Defense, the Ministry of Defense, Ukraine, Russia, they spend trillions on missiles that are good for one thing.
Yeah.
What is Twitter? Twitter's a platform. What was Facebook? Facebook is a platform. It's used for data collection. It's used for data dispersion. It's used for radicalization. It was obvious that he was going to burn Twitter. And here's a fun part. So I discovered this back in, I believe, late 2020. Elon Musk is into technocracy and transhumanism. And if you understand anything about transhumanism and you go back, it's actually started by a Russian philosopher called Fyodorov. And it was a school of thought called cosmism. And these guys are all in this like whacked out sci-fi brain cult. I mean, Elon Musk wants to put chips in people's heads, right? Like they think they're the Ubermensch. And I don't know what's wrong with them, because Elon Musk wasn't even born in the US. He can't be freaking president. What?
Well, so I want to get off of Musk, because there's so many more important things to talk about. But yes, we do need to also deal with the weaponization of our information and the desire to always snuff out truth during this horrible war that we're in.
I have one question real fast. Do you think that Zelensky will put the headstone for Putin's regime in Kherson or Bakhmut?
The headstone. Christmas Day, I was watching. I just, after I came back from a nice lunch, I stuck on Netflix, and one of the first things that it suggested was a Tom Cruise film, a Mission Impossible, and it happened to be the one where the Kremlin blows up at the start, right? And so I just recorded it from my sofa and said, you know, the tradition of watching a film on Christmas Day, you know. The tombstone for the Kremlin regime is going to be firmly planted in Moscow, so that the people there can forever be reminded of the horror that they allowed to unfold. Because do you know what? Here's the thing, right? It's not just this war in Ukraine, either since 2014 or the 24th of February. Like, what the way that society has developed in Russia, the acceptance of authoritarianism in exchange for a little bit more material wealth over the first, you know, years of the Putin presidency, when it was, you know, the oil price was rising, not because he was an economic genius, right? But at the same time as they made that kind of social contract, Anna Politkovskaya was murdered on Putin's birthday on October the 7th, right? They tried to poison her previously. You know, and then 2014, Boris Nemtsov is shot, right? He's the most high-profile opposition leader at the time in Russia, and they did nothing. They did nothing. So let that tombstone be a reminder to them of what they allowed to develop in their country.
Well, as somebody who, you know, is an Irishman who moved to Ukraine, lives in Kyiv, has been helping people by establishing the first suicide hotline, again, dealing with a lot of veterans who had PTSD from the initial phase of this war. It's important to note that Putin psyoped his own people first. So in the late 90s, online in Russia, people were very pro-liberal democracy, getting that first, you know, taste of freedom that they hadn't had in so long. And what did he do? He moved the state online and started psyoping people and pushing them toward totalitarianism. So he opted his own people first, and I'm sure continues to do so. So that's one thing I want you to address. But I also pulled up a clip of a Clark Gable film from 1940 with Hedy Lamarr called Comrade X. And there's a scene, he's a reporter, and there's a scene where one of the other reporters is telling him, you know, he missed some press release at the Kremlin that day. And he asked her how it was. And she's like, oh, same old rat trap full of stuffed shirts, double crossing the masses. Someday the people are going to get wise and take it apart brick by brick. How do we reach the people when they have been, a number has been run on them for decades as well? Sometimes I look at them historically, there are long-suffering people. How do we reach him when he sealed off the information borders? And then I do want to talk about mental health in Ukraine, as well as obviously we suffer here too.
So the propaganda in Russia is, I mean, it is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. It is insidious, and it is deliberately warmongering, and it exists through many channels as well. Some are, the kind of stuff that Julia Davis analyzes.
Yeah.
Much of it is far more subtle than that. It's in their regular programming that they're also being given messaging and being subjected to this kind of stuff. And it is what has allowed many of these people, as well as other certain psychological conditions that exist, or certain mentalities that exist because of conditions in Russia.
Yeah.
For example, the bulk of the fighting force being drawn from the poorer regions, where in all likelihood they've been victims of authority throughout their life, because the police act with impunity, right? And now when they come into Ukraine and they've got guns in their hand, they're the ones in authority. And for them, it's absolutely normal that authority is abused, right? So, there's a deeper sickness that is going on in Russia.
Systemic.
Yeah, it is systemic, and it is very deliberate. But I've asked myself on several occasions, and I've written an article about this at some point in the future, one of my propaganda articles that I've written. There was a point towards the collapse of the Soviet Union where people knew that they were being lied to. It became a joke, right? Listen, Moscow speaking, right? What are they going on about now, right? And at some point, that also has to happen to this incarnation. It's not the USSR, it is now the Russian Federation for the time being. And there's going to be a trigger when many people it's going to dawn on them that they've been subjected to an absolute catalog of lies.
Bingo.
And that is, once again, the destruction of the myth of this great, strong nation that was just going to come in here and take over Ukraine in a special military operation in 3 days, right?
Yes.
When the military is finally and completely defeated, and the Russian Federation, for now, again, when they capitulate, that is going to shatter much of the long-held beliefs based on a smokescreen that many people in Russia have, I believe, because how else can it end, right?
Oh, brilliant. I would love to see that. High five.
So I would like to point out and ask your take on this. We know in Germany prior to World War II that Hitler and his cronies took over media. They started pumping the propaganda, and the nation was behind them.
Yeah.
And this did not end until the nation of Germany was shown the true horrors that they were complicit in.
Well, it ended with Allied bombs, but yes.
Yeah, unfortunately,
to your point, yes.
Yeah, but the people themselves did, even when the bombs were dropping, they thought we're the good guys, right? Until such time as they were shown the actual atrocities, the German people were shown the horror. They still thought Hitler was the good guy. Will that have to happen to Putin? I mean, we know that there are atrocities going. The Russians went into battle with transportable crematoriums to hide their crimes. They're stealing children from the Ukraine.
Torturing.
They're torturing people. There's rape. There's what is transpiring. I mean, even war itself is an abhorrent idea, but I understand it has to happen because we're at the base primates. But the way they're conducting themselves in this war are crimes. And when will the world stand up to that?
So the world is already standing up to it. When will Russians stand up to it is the question.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
the point that you make about how the German people acquiesced along that journey. I went with a friend a couple of weeks ago to watch the film The Pianist, and
yeah,
it shows how the rights of Jews were systematically stripped away from them, how they were forced into ghettos, how walls were built and there was glass on top of them, and how people are, as in Bucha and Irpin, randomly shot in the street, right? The way that they got away with that, and it wasn't that the German population only found out at the end of the Second World War what had been going on. They witnessed it. They witnessed this dehumanization of a group of society. And what Putin has replicated, and that is why he is exactly like Hitler, is exactly that same mentality. I watched a film today. I had a chat with my son today, and I sent it to him while we were having this conversation. I said, watch this and see what Russian society has become, right? And there was a lady on a bus in Russia, and she's talking about the state of the war, and she's saying again the same kind of thing, like, we think we're a great state and we're sending soldiers there with rubber boots and blah blah blah. And the instinct of everybody on the bus is to call her by a slur word that they use for Ukrainian people, right? And several people are saying this to her. And then the bus pulls into a stop and a guy goes and grabs her. The lady's probably between 60, 65 years old, right? She's, you know, I mean, she's a pensioner, right? And a guy grabs her, pulls her out of her seat and pulls her along the floor of the bus and kicks her out of the bus, right? And there's not a single person on that bus that reacts or says, what are you doing? This is an older woman. How dare you, right? So that's the degree of hatred that exists throughout Russian society.
wow.
And that is why they are allowed to not only get away with the war crimes that people know are going on, right? I mean,
wow.
we've heard, you mentioned rapes. I remember hearing an intercept of a guy speaking to his wife where his wife actually gave him permission to rape women in Ukraine, right? I mean, that is the degree of hatred that Vladimir Putin has engendered amongst his people.
Yes.
But what we should look at is the reason why he has to do that, and why fundamentally his regime is so weak and prone, likely to collapse, is because it offers nothing. Yeah. It is not an alternative worldview that can compete in a competition of ideals. Vladimir Putin struggles to stay in power because he has amassed enormous wealth, right, by having been in these positions, and he has enriched all of his friends as well.
Yes.
And you know, we've seen it here in Ukraine with Viktor Yanukovych, with the various other oligarchs that have been taken down a peg or two, right?
Yeah.
Kolomoisky, for example, you know, and it's not an existential fight for Russia itself as a country. When they come out of this, they will still have their natural resources, although they're going to be paying reparations to Ukraine for decades to come. But and I believe that the Russian Federation will splinter from its current form as well. It is only an existential fight for Putin and for his oligarchs around him, so that they can remain in power and continue to abuse that power. That's what this is about.
Right. And why I'm concerned when I hear you speak, because I agree, and bravo, is that everything you described has been coming here to America. Everything that you've described, the way the people are being manipulated, the anger and the fear and the self-righteousness and all the propaganda and all that shit has come here for the same goddamn reasons, which is to hide the corruption of very small and weak and evil men who have amassed a lot of wealth through their transnational mob ties. So it's the same shit coming here. And I really hope before it takes root the way it has in Russia, that we're able to tear those roots up, bring people back together, stave off civil war. And as Hi-Fi says, cage some of these guys, let us see. I keep saying the same thing. In 2023, we will find out if we are a rule of law country. I want to say one quick thing and then have Hi-Fi take us out. There was a report from the Internet Research Agency about somebody who had worked there for a few months as a troll. There was a moment in time when this person who was getting their propaganda orders from some local official who was coming in, just telling them lies about Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. This is probably 2015. And there was a moment in time where this very human person no longer felt anything. This person knew that they were being lied to and no longer cared. The empathy was being deleted from his system and he just didn't care. And somehow through some series of events, even though the money was so good, he managed to get out after a few months. But you're clearly dealing with mental health issues, psychological issues. And in Ukraine, you literally are dealing with people who are probably getting PTSD as I'm even speaking, as bombs and air raid sirens are going on all around them. What is something that you can tell the world at large about, anything that you can give them to help them acknowledge and really sort of retain their sense of self as we go through this challenging, variations on war?
That's a deep question. At heart, I've always been an optimist, and I've always tried to play a positive part in my community, in my society, and because of that, because I'm always looking for, okay, so things are difficult now, and not just here in Ukraine, but I'm always looking for what is the positive end game, and I focus on that. I mean, for example, during the Battle of Kiev, and I'm personally in very difficult circumstances here. It was the supply chains were non-existent. It was hard to find food. I used to go between different supermarkets, seeing what I could find, and one day I passed a line of buses outside a bunch of residential buildings, and there were a lot of elderly people who were choosing to evacuate, and those were difficult times, and I'm reading about the various different classifications or categories of difficulties that people are going through, and what helped me to refocus was that I started to see Lifeline Ukraine as a not just our national suicide prevention hotline, and we're there for people in times of emotional crisis, but I started looking at it from a disaster management perspective, because that's the scale of what's upon us right now.
Yes.
And I read certain books, and then I began looking at each of these individual kinds of difficulties that we would be facing in our work when people are calling us for various different reasons. And I set about devising a training course for my colleagues that would give them tools and knowledge in each of these specific areas. In actual fact, the next one that's coming up is victims of sexual violence, and we're already encountering them. They call us already. My mission to rebuild following the events of the 24th of February and everything that's happened since, my mission to rebuild Lifeline Ukraine was based around knowledge and about growing our knowledge and recognizing the situation that we were in, and that's what gave me focus. That is now what I'm delivering. That's now what I'm fulfilling, thanks to our actually American. We're currently funded by a grant from USAID, so I thank you, the people of America, for sending some cash our way to help us support the people that need it.
Well, What I'm hearing from that is a mantra that I live by, and that is, you are taking action to be of service. I know whenever I despair, if I take action to be of service, even in a small way, it gets me out of these tears that you're seeing right here. Hi-Fi, final word.
My final word is no country is inoculated against the lure of fascism. We saw that here in the United States. You know, we are putting our immigrants in ghettos like they did the Jews. We did that under the Trump administration. Forced sterilization at the border. We did that. The fact that Trump tried to throw a coup to maintain control in this country, and now the United States is memory holding that. I mean, when we look at the problem of January 6th, there was an army in the Capitol. Who paid for that army? Who moved that army? Who recruited for that army? Who built that army? None of that is being explored. And I worry that those oligarchs that are, you know, through the network attached to Vladimir Putin are not going to be punished here. Now, in Ukraine, it seems like the oligarchs are being taken to task. What would you say to the American government about these agents of Putin?
Thank you.
The first thing, and I again, an article I wrote for Byline Times was around the inauguration of Joe Biden, and I said there, you have to know your enemy. And what many people in the United States, I think Hi-Fi, you missed off the list there, not just the people who planned and financed and, you know, created the orders and the battle plans for what happened on January 6th, but the people who have attempted to excuse it and downplay it and talk about it as if it was not actually a very serious, major set of crimes against the United States of America. What the US has to do is to know your enemy, and to know that, you know, and so you look at Josh Hawley, Marjorie Taylor Greene, you know, and
Matt Gaetz.
Matt Gaetz, yeah, exactly.
Ted Cruz, Greg Abbott, Ron DeSantis.
Dana Baker, who you mentioned earlier on as well, you know, Tucker Carlson, right? These people that, you know, in recent times, they're being upplayed by Russian media who are showing clips of them. And what you have to understand is that if Russia is on your side, you're on the wrong goddamn side. Russia means absolutely no good to the United States of America. Russia is your enemy. That would be my thoughts.
And I would also like to add, Russia is our enemy and we're at war.
Yes. Yeah. Even though, and I just read a great book by John Sweeney called The Killer in the Kremlin. And, you know, he talks to people who are saying that one of the problems in the West is that you don't realize that you're at war, right? And so therefore you're not preparing for war. But if the enemy believes that they're at war with you, and Russia certainly does because they're interfering everywhere, you're de facto in a state of war.
That's right. As Paul Mason taught us, quoting Trotsky, you might not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Paul, that was more than we could have asked for. And I always say this is your second appearance on RadPod. Please come back.
I will happily come back. And I'm so glad that my electricity held out so that we got right the way through today.
What our friends don't know is we tried to film this episode yesterday, and as soon as we started, the power went out due to Putin's war crimes and terrorist acts on Ukraine. Paul Niland, we love you. Be safe. Blessings to you and your family and all the people of Ukraine who are fighting on behalf of democracy worldwide. We are so grateful you took the time with us today.
And I'm grateful for having had this opportunity to chat with you and your audience. And of course, I'll come back.
Okay, wonderful. All right. A beautiful new year that brings peace. All right.
Let's hope.
Okay. Mwah.